Imagine it. The year is 1820. At this point in the U.S. history, most of the land associated with the U.S. is actually just territories, because the process of turning a territory into a state is a lot of drama. In 1820, the drama is whether or not that territory should be a free state or a slave state. During James Monroe's tenure as president, 5 more states will be added to the roster, the last of which being Missouri. To get Missouri to statehood, we have to go back to when the movement first started, as early as 1817. At that point, the residents were pretty ready to make it official, and pretty soon an application for statehood was submitted. So at this point in history, there were 22 states, and they were perfectly evenly divided between free states and slave states. Having Missouri submit an application for statehood presented a very chaotic situation. If they were a free state, then that would put the Northerners, typically Northern Republicans, ahead of the Southerners. So this presented an issue because obviously vice versa would also be a problem. Nobody wanted either party to have a leg up. So what do we do? In early 1819, James Talmadge Jr., a New York representative, proposed 2 amendments to go with the statehood application, and that was his way of keeping slavery from spreading. People in the South, Southern representatives, disagreed with that because they thought that it was wrong for a federal regulation to restrict slavery, that slavery was a state issue. Northerners, however, believed that the Constitution was put together in a way that would eventually lead to an end of slavery. And I quote, Northern Republicans rooted their anti-slavery arguments not on expediency, but on egalitarian morality. The Constitution, strictly interpreted, gave the sons of the founding generations the legal tools to hasten the removal of slavery, including the refusal to admit additional slave states. It was around this time that Maine also wanted to become a state. So the representatives saw an opportunity. Sure, we will make Maine a free state as long as Missouri is not. Another representative, Jesse Thomas, actually came up with a different idea, a sort of compromise. And he said, how about we say no more slave states above the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase? The compromise passed the Senate, but it didn't pass the House of Representatives because the Northern Republicans wanted Missouri to be free, period. Desperate to make a vote happen and to pass this bill, the Speaker of the House decided to really try hard to move people. And to be fair, on both sides of the issue, people were moved to make a vote. It just was not enough, not for the 15th session of Congress anyway. The representative from Georgia who inspired the county in which I grew up in had this to say in support of Missouri being a slave state. You have kindled a fire which all the waters of the ocean cannot put out, which seas of blood can only extinguish. In other words, if you don't make Missouri a slave state, so help me. And now a quote from Talmadge, which was against Missouri being a slave state. If dissolution of the Union must take place, let it be so. If civil war, which gentlemen so much threaten, must come, I can only say, let it come. As you can see, both sides of the argument were pretty passionate. No progress was made in Congress by the time they closed for the season, but it was the topic of debate immediately when they opened the next season for the 16th session of Congress. And the 2 amendments proposed by James Thomas was added that specifically stated no slave state shall be admitted above the 30 by 36 parallel in the Louisiana Purchase. Before signing the bill, there was another legality issue now of having Maine and Missouri on the same bill. So they split the bill in two, one for each state. The problem with that is now there was no new restrictions for slavery other than the amendment from Thomas. Nevertheless, the bill was made into law and signed by Monroe in March. But wait, there's more. When the good people of Missouri put together their Constitution, they had in it a clause that said that freed slaves and mulattoes weren't allowed in the state borders. So you can imagine that was pretty controversial. So the great compromiser, Henry Clay, stepped in to fix it. And what was added was, and I quote, an act of admission was finally passed if the exclusionary clause of the Missouri Constitution should never be construed to authorize the passage of any law impairing the privileges and immunities of any U.S. citizen. Basically, this was to keep Missouri from passing any laws that discriminated against free black citizens. And that was referred to as the Second Missouri Compromise. Now, it would be easy to link the Missouri Compromise with the Civil War, which would take place decades later. And that's because it essentially planted the seed where the roots would continue to grow in division of the two opposing sides, the slave states and the free states. So much so that 34 years later, the Missouri Compromise was repealed. And the reason was to get wealthy slave owners to move out westward. As you can imagine, just as the reason it was controversial in 1819, it was just as controversial in 1854. So that actually prompted the severely anti slavery Abraham Lincoln to get back into politics. And we all know how that ended. To learn more about the presidency of James Monroe or Abraham Lincoln, feel free to check back for their presidential episodes.